first of all, the introduction of the Or Hagon, of the Yechida and the Or Hagon, that Or into Mashiach himself, without any kind of preparation, the Klal Yisrael would fundamentally produce two results. It would first of all confuse Klal Yisrael. They would become very confused because it would be difficult for them to recognize clearly what is going on. That's number one. And number two, it would threaten them and they become very frightened. Now this is a very important Nakuda. If the Mashiach appeared now and suddenly was Megal himself to Klal Yisrael would become very frightened. It would be a tremendous, almost a terror that would go through Klal Yisrael, and if not the world, but the Klal Yisrael. What is the terror? The terror is the following, and it has to do with the certain thing called these phase relationships that a person has with Ruchnius. Before the Mashiach comes, Klal Yisrael is in a state of the Ikvus Mashiach. In that state, they're in a very low state, meaning that they're very heavily covered by a klipa. Their sensitivities to Ruchnius are dulled. Their motivation to Ruchnius is very weak. If the Mashiach suddenly appeared and opened a new light, it would become very, very threatening to them, because they would not handle it, and in their particular matzav, it would be in a situation actually where it would threaten them. Because Klal Yisrael in that matzav is in a state of very powerful klipa. That means that each person has a certain level of sheker and a certain level of emes. Every person runs on both of these things. There's a certain level of sheker and a certain level of emes. And the reason why there's sheker and emes has to do, of course, with the klipa or the ketubim that our person, his chatoim and his mitzvahs. But in addition to that, it also has to do with the chet of Adam Rishon and the chet of the Egel. All of Klal Yisrael has a klipa because of their own particular maisim, and that they have a klipa also because of the previous chatoim that existed from the time of Adam Rishon and the chet of the Egel. So there's a zoyama which is implanted in the mind and the shama of every Yid today, which relates to those previous critical chatoim. That zoyama makes it very, very difficult for a person to handle pure emes. If such a person suddenly would see pure emes, it would literally be extremely shocked into the system. It could even be lethal. You find that exactly what happened by Mamre Har Sinai. What happened was that Klal Yisrael was in a situation when they heard the first two mitzvahs, suddenly their neshamas jumped out because they couldn't handle the power of that ruchnius. What you see from this is a very interesting thing, that it's not just simply a matter of just giving a person a lot of ruchnius and that's the end of it. Too much ruchnius could be dangerous. Too much emes begins to cause a tremendous instability in the very person himself. Too much instability in the person himself, and he really can't handle it. It causes a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of tension. It's too much truth. The person cannot adhere to such a level of truth, and in order to function, he has to cover it up. But he can't cover it up because it's too powerful. So what happens is, it reduces the person to almost a stuporous state, where he just can't handle the situation. Now again, this has to be understood very clearly. If a person is in a certain state of ruchnius, it reveals to him a certain light, which he cannot handle in terms of his personality and in terms of his kochas hanefesh, then that light cannot be shut off because the ruchnius is there. But what it does is it begins to undermine every one of his defenses against too high of an explosion of ruchnius, and what happens is he breaks down and cannot function. He goes into a state of anxiety, a state of tension, or a state of inactivity, passivity, and he can't function. A state of confusion and turmoil. That's what too much ruchnius does. For example, let's say a malach would suddenly megala himself to you. Chances are you wouldn't live through the experience. Why? Because you could not handle such an open gilui of ruchnius. It would be extremely difficult. And the amount of Yetzirah that you have, the amount of Zerma that you have in your system, will become totally undermined and threatened by it. And it would be very difficult to sustain that kind of thing. That is the kind of matter that Klal Yisrael will be in if the Mashiach was Megal himself. In other words, if the redemption only happened to the Mashiach himself, and not the Klal Yisrael, if there was a transformation in terms of the Mashiach himself, but there was no transformation that would happen alternatively to Klal Yisrael as well, Klal Yisrael could not accept or handle what the Mashiach has to offer. They will be what's called out of phase. Their ability, their present state, their existential state, as it concerns Sheker and Zoyama, will be too great to handle the kind of emes that comes out. So, the only solution to that kind of problem is to transform Klal Yisrael itself. And that's the other side of the Gula. The other side of the Gula is that there will be a specific action which will be done to raise Klal Yisrael out of the Indian of the Klippas and give them an extraordinary sensitivity. The Pasuk is Megala that. When it says, V'eshpach ruchi al kol basar, the Bonisham says, I will bring forth or pour forth my Ruach, which is the Kedusha, on every person. Now, that's coming from the Bonisham. That's not coming directly from the Mashiach himself. Although the Mashiach plays a very strong part of that, you see. But there is an additional dimension of a new Ruach that comes down from the Shemayim to us, that suddenly every neshama is suddenly activated and sensitized to a new level of emes. Now, there's an interesting story that which I think is very relevant, where this is a couple hundred years ago in Sfas, somebody went to town screaming, the Mashiach is here, the Mashiach is here. So one of David Tzaddik, he put his head out of the window and he said, funny, I don't feel any different, I don't smell anything different, I don't see anything different, because the truth of the matter is that if the Mashiach were really coming, all Klal Yisrael will suddenly feel differently in themselves. They will begin to feel a kind of sensitivity to emes, a motivation to know what's true that they have never felt before in their entire lives. The Pasuk says this. Hine yomim boim, Num Hashem. There are days that are coming that Num Hashem sheyesh tzomon amayim v'rov lelechem. Yesh tzomon v'rov, aval lo tzomon amayim v'rov lelechem. There's going to come a time when there will be a tremendous famine, but not for bread, and a thirst, but not for water. Kim l'dvar Hashem. You see, that describes the state. What's going to happen as the Mashiach arrives is that there will be another state, an alternative state to Klal Yisrael, where they will become sensitized to a new level of emes. And they'll all start looking around and saying, wait a minute, everything that we know up to now is not satisfactory. There's something wrong. We need an emes which is much greater. And they will all go around as if they're in a famine or thirst. This will be basically the matzah of Klal Yisrael at that time. But that will come from a different hashpah. So thus, in the beginning of the Gula, which relates to the Ruchnis of Klal Yisrael, there will be two hashpahs. One hashpah is on the Mashiach himself, and the other hashpah is on Klal Yisrael, around or near the same time. One hashpah, which is on the Mashiach, makes the Mashiach into a Noisin, where he's makabel the Torah, first of all, from the Shemayim, and then he has the ability to become a Noisin to Klal Yisrael, to give it over. And the other hashpah is down on Klal Yisrael itself, so they have the koyach now to become a makabel. And it's very important to realize that these are two hashpahs working on two ends of the things. Either hashpah on one end or the other would be very disturbing and turbulent for the Bria. To put Klal Yisrael in a state of very heightened sensitivity to Ruchnius without the Mashiach would be to condemn them to a tremendous state of agitation. Because they would be looking around for an emes and there would be nowhere to find it. And you have to remember one very important thing, that in this heightened state of sensitivity, Klal Yisrael would never be satisfied with the stuff that's available today. They would not be satisfied with any single sefer, chidushim, or any kind of Torah which is extant today. It's the kind of sensitivity which would sensitize Klal Yisrael to the Oro Shel Mashiach. It's that level of sensitivity. When it says, Or Chodosh al Tzion To'ir, that's all we're talking about. The Hashpon Klal Yisrael will sensitize Klal Yisrael to that all. Anything less than that all is totally unsatisfactory and will be completely rejected. So therefore, Klal Yisrael with that Hashpon, without a Mashiach, is in a state of a man running around trying to find food and water, and he can't find anything to eat and drink. You see, he's in a state of intense deprivation. At the same time, if the Hashpah only came on the Mashiach and not on Klal Yisrael would not be makabel from him, because they wouldn't be sensitized to what he has to say. Number one, they wouldn't really be able to makir what's really going on. It would produce a state of confusion. But more than that, since they are so much lower than that ore, when that ore suddenly becomes available, it would constitute a very powerful threat to them, to their state of klipa and zerma. You see, it's like taking a guy. They say the marshal zone is like taking a person who has ulcers and putting him into a suda. He can't appreciate it. Not only all the food actually disturbs him very greatly, and it totally disturbs his sense of mind, his sense of peace, because he sees all this fantastic food around and he can't eat it. And if he actually did eat it, it would literally threaten his life. That's what we find over here also. With the Hashpah only comes in the Mashiach, and if it would not come on Klal Yisrael would be totally threatened by this particular awe. So they would have to take certain matters in their hands. What would they have to do? They would have to attack the Mashiach and attempt to dislodge him by some way, even if they would have to kill him. To do that, to remove that disturbance from their midst in that way, or they'd have to ignore it, they'd have to deal with it. You see, it's like a person suddenly deals with a certain stress that's coming from him. He's got to deal with it, in some way. Either he has to remove it, or he has to run away from it, flight or fight. Some kind of adjustment has to be done. So instead, what happens here is that the Hashpah goes on both. You see, and that's how one really recognizes the other. Klal Yisrael will know that the Mashiach has arrived because they will know about this new heightened sensitivity. Not only that, they will know that this guy is the Mashiach. Why? Because this is the only one who can satisfy their tzama and their love. That's how they will know that's the Mashiach. It's the combination of both that will clearly engage both factions into the Gula itself. And this is the critical thing, that there are two aspects of the Gula of Ruchnius. The aspect of the Gula that takes place on the Mashiach, and the aspects of the Gula that takes place in Klal Yisrael. And it's the coordinated, simultaneous movement of both in that aliyah that will allow this to take place. Now, where do you see this? Where do you see this? You see this in the pasuk Hinei Yashkel Avdi V'Yom V'Nas V'Gav Miyoid. Hinei Yashkel Avdi in that pasuk, according to the Medrash, refers to the Mashiach, and that's Ika. But the Rishonim also in the V'Yom also ties up as go on Klal Yisrael. And the truth of the matter, it goes on both. Hinei Yashkel Avdi goes on the Mashiach and on Klal Yisrael. Both begin to experience that aliyah. Both remove themselves from the Zohar, or both are removed from the Zohar. But it's the Mashiach who removes the Zohar from Klal Yisrael. But both are, the Zohar is removed, both go out of the Klippa and both go up. That's the meaning of Even Mo'asu Aboinim Hoysol Rosh Pina, what we say in Hallel. You see, that applies first of all on the Mashiach, because the Mashiach before his arrival is in a state of Kilkul, and Klal Yisrael before his arrival is in a state of Kilkul. Even Mo'asu Aboinim, the stone that everyone was repulsed by, this becomes the main cornerstone, the chief building block of the thing. This applies to the Mashiach, that individual who no one could have suspected was the Mashiach, suddenly becomes the Mashiach, and the nation, where all the Ummahs of the Olam, all the Ummahs of the world say, this is the lowest of the nations, suddenly becomes the main principal nation of the Bria itself. You see, the ability to raise up the Mashiach b'kukuloi and put him b'tikunoi, and the ability to raise up Klal Yisrael b'kukulam and raise them b'tikunam, you see, is an incredible ness. To such a degree, this is, from the Baruch Shalom, it is truly a miraculous event. And it applies on both because of the double hashpah that goes down. Why must there be a double hashpah? Obviously, because the Mashiach cannot become a Mashiach until Klal Yisrael is zeicha to a Gula. Remember, the whole possibility, the whole function of Mashiach only rests on the ability of Klal Yisrael to approach the Gula. The Gula starts with Klal Yisrael. Moshe lost the Mashiach because Klal Yisrael did the chait of the Egel. That's why. It's Klal Yisrael through their avodah, through the Yisurim, and through their Golus, that brings the last of the Tikkunim in the world, which brings finally the Gula Asida, the Gula Shlema. And once that happens, with the Tikkunim that Klal Yisrael has established, this gives koyach to the Mashiach himself to redeem himself and bring himself out of the klipa, and naturally, at the same time, Klal also goes out of the klipa. So therefore, it's a simultaneous event. I've explained the simultaneity in terms of the consistency of both, that you need one in terms of the other. But the truth of the matter is, more fundamentally, both things happen at the same time, because both the things control each other. The Gula of Klal determines the Gula of the Mashiach in that sense. So you cannot have one without the other. There's a very good concept here to experience a certain kind of feeling. It's important to grasp that concept that a person has to be ready to makabel a certain level of ruchnis. You may all say, well, that sounds intellectually correct, but I don't know that I've ever experienced that. And that's not true. Everyone has always, in this room, everyone has always experienced that. Yourself. Because what happens is, you ever notice, basically what it is, it's almost a non-conscious event. You ever notice, sometimes if you see something which is a very strong MS, a very powerful MS, and it moves you, you find yourself instantly enough suddenly beginning to divorce yourself from becoming involved with that MS again. You find it a certain irritation to become involved with that source of MS. You see, I don't know if you experience that, but that's sometimes what happens. Or that is the defense which the person is manipulating to avoid the clash between his current ruchnistic state with its zoyama and what's coming in front of him. What the zoyama of a person does and what the yetzer of a person does, it makes him extremely uncomfortable with ruchnius. Very uncomfortable. It's very hard for him to deal with it. When I mean ruchnius, I mean certain truths that are extremely powerful. It's very hard to deal with. And what a person will find himself doing is just going away from it, not having anything to do with it. And he'll rationalize, say, well, the reason why I don't have anything to do with this thing now because I'm busy here, or I got involved in this, or, well, it's not important, or something else. But many times what underlies it, if you'll examine your own experience, sometimes you'll come into contact with a certain kind of ruchnistic experience, or a certain level of chokhmah, or a certain level of yira, you see. And then when that experience is over, you'll find yourself very reluctant to get back into the same circumstance which would again initiate that kind of experience. And you'll find that when you're reluctant, you'll find that reluctance manifest as a certain uneasiness. It's almost like a slight a discomfort to get involved in that thing again. Where does that discomfort come from? That discomfort comes from the zoyama, from the klipa. That's exactly what makes a person uncomfortable with ruchnius. And that's the key inhibitive ingredient that Klal would have if that ore suddenly comes down without them being ready to do it. They literally become extremely uncomfortable in that kind of ore. And if it's a very powerful ore, it will become very threatening. And they would do everything they can to avoid it. All of us have experienced that kind of discomfort. It's just simply you have to think into your own background, you see. When you conspicuously kind of avoid or rationalize the avoidance of getting involved with too much ruchnius, too much kedusha, too much emes, you will notice, if you think clearly yourself, that you can sometimes stop yourself or see yourself actually in the process of avoidance of too much ruchnius. Where do you see this question of what's called phase relationships? We see this again. We've seen this before. And again, I would like to repeat this because this is a very critical idea, that a person is a physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual being. There are 4 dimensions, or 4 aspects of a person's being, you see. Each of these 4 areas are in some way in contact or in tune with outside stimuli. Now, in a more general sense, if you take any one of these areas, take the physical area. The physical means the ability of a person to be physically healthy. If physical stimuli come to that person and it's too great, what happens? Then it produces a tremendous stress on the person physically. You see what I'm saying? For example, if a person has a certain physical condition, a certain cardiovascular condition, a certain level of endurance, and he suddenly engages in an activity which is much greater than his capacity for his heart and lungs to process, what happens? He puts himself in a life-threatening situation, or else he can do damage to his heart. The same thing with not only cardiovascular, also the musculoskeletal system. If a person lifts something which is too great for his body to handle, he can break his bone, or he can damage his muscles, or whatever happens. In other words, if a specific aspect of a person comes in contact with stimuli which is too powerful for that aspect to handle, it will cause a breakdown of the person. And he must handle it in one way. Either he has to instantly stop, block the stimuli, or do something to the stimuli, because the system is out of equilibrium. There's a state of unequilibrium here. Well, it's the same thing in an emotional level. There are certain situations when a person emotionally can get into it, you see, which may be too powerful and mamish cause a breakdown, a complete nervous breakdown, in that sense. Same thing intellectually. Sometimes a person can get involved in a series of ideas which are so complex that his entire brain suddenly goes up and says, stop, I'm confused. Confusion reigns, like a billboard. You know what I mean? Because it's too much to process at one time. It's the same thing with the fourth aspect, ruchnius. Ruchnius, which is the fourth aspect, the spiritual dimension of the person, is demonstrated by a person's desire for truth versus his desire for gashmius. You see, and the level of zoyama, or the level of certain veneer of sheker which exists on the person. That's the fourth aspect. Now, when suddenly a stimulus comes in which is extremely powerful, you see, it can cause a breakdown. For example, if suddenly the Yetzer Hara becomes 10 times as powerful as a person in an abnormal way, what will happen? Suddenly a person will completely succumb to the Satan, right? And his koyach of emes suddenly begins to break down. It causes them a very difficult ability to handle emes. In vice versa, it can also. A person can sometimes can approach or become involved with stimuli of emes, which are too powerful. For example, he can master certain things that he was never mastered in his life. Suddenly he can understand an emes, which is very powerful and moves him very deeply. What does that do? What that does is that moves him inside, and it begins to affect the balance between emes and sheker. So then when he goes out into the world, you see, and he suddenly confronts his old level of Yetzer Hara, there's a disturbance. Because now he has to do with the old level of Yetzer Hara, which is still strong, and his new level of Hasaga, you see. And the two sometimes are very difficult to mesh. So he feels extremely uncomfortable. There's a strong state of unequilibrium. What is the natural thing to do? Well, the natural thing that the person attempts to do is to establish a state of equilibrium, you see. So what the tendency is to remove the discomfort. The easiest way to remove the discomfort is to get away from the emes and to crawl back into that level of Yetzer Hara. And that is exactly what the Yetzer Hara says. The Yetzer Hara says, forget about this other thing. Get rid of it. Either it's no good, or puzzle it up in some way, or rationalize yourself out of it. But don't get involved with that. You see, maintain this level of gashmius, of materialism. That's where it belongs. And the person will do it. But if the person realizes that this is a Nisoyan, what he'll attempt to do is attempt to lower the level of Yetzer Hara, you see. And by doing that, the new level of emes can reside in the person without problems. You see what I'm saying? You can work it either way. And that's really what it is. The truth of the matter is that all growth in our Avodah, all growth in Mesiras Nefesh in terms of being Yerushalayim, is nothing more than a constant battle against new states of disequilibrium. That's really what it is. Because at any point in time, a person has certain koiches in ruchnius. He has certain Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov at any point in time. If he attempts to build himself in Yerushalayim, right, by learning more Torah, or whatever the story is, what's going to happen? He's going to suddenly become unstable. He's going to lose his balance. Right? That's the nature of growth. The essence of growth lies in the fact that he must lose his balance. But as soon as he begins to lose his balance, he has to deal with a state of discomfort. Now, how is he going to deal with it? Well, that's the whole thing. What the Yetzer Hara attempts to say is, drop the growth and go back to where you were before, and in that way establish a comfortable situation. You see. But if the person is intent on avodah, intent on Yerushalayim, and he knows that this is the right way, what he'll do is he'll allow the new level of Kedusha to come in and attempt to lower, you see, the level of Tumah or Yetzer Hara or Zerma in that sense. Now, that's That is the normal level of growth. All growth takes place exactly in this way. It's a constant undermining of spiritual equilibrium and a re-establishment of a new state of equilibrium. And then you undermine that state, re-establish the next state, and so on and so forth. It's a constant growth. This growth pattern is exactly the same in all the other aspects too, in physical growth, or in emotional growth, intellectual growth. They all have that. Growth in any realm means undermining the established equilibrium of the person in that state because of the introduction of new stimuli, which is more powerful than the state can handle, you see, and then slowly restructuring oneself so that he gradually reorients himself to a new state of equilibrium, so that his present structure can now handle the new stimuli. Where do we see the concept of phase relationships, where we use the concept of balance in that kind of sense? Probably the most prominent area that you saw it was in the four Tanoim, or Dalet Shenichnes Apardas, the four Tanoim who attempted to go into the biggest mysteries of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva, who came out whole, he was able to go into the Pnimis and come out alive. Ben Azai died, Shimon ben Azai died, Shimon ben Zoma became a psychotic, Shaita, he went out of his mind, and Elisha ben Abuya, Acha, became a min. Now, why did each one respond the way they did? The answer is because of the phase relationships. To go to that level where they wanted to go, which is Pardes, I want to explain before that what they were attempting to do was to go to the Nun Share Bina. The Nun Share Bina, which is the highest level of Bina, lies in the bottom of the Klippa, because the Nun Share Bina lies in the level where even Moshe wasn't able to get. Why? Because of the Chet of the Egel. Because of the Chet of the Egel, Klal Yisrael lost a certain level of the service of the Ketzer, the thing, and that went into the Klippa. The Satan has it. So to attempt to get that means that you have to go approach the Satan himself, or the Klippa, and retrieve it. You see, Moshe lost it because of the Chet of the Egel. Rabbi Akiva tried to do it, and these other three, they all tried to get back that last or, which was the Ika or. Now that or happens to be the Or Shel Mashiach. That happens to be part of the or that relates to the Moshe Mashiach. And these four attempted to get that or before its time, you see, in some way. And maybe by that, maybe they wanted to bring the Gula. I don't know what exactly their intent was. But there's no question, which I believe is that the or which they were trying to get was the Nun Share Bina, which had Shaykh to the Or Shel Mashiach, you see. Now, whatever reason you want to get it for, if you want to get it, where do you have to go get it? You have to go get it from the Klippa. And when I mean Klippa, I'm talking about the essence of the Zohar itself, because that's where the Or Shel Mashiach is, that's where the Yechidah was. So they wanted to retrieve an or which is the bottom of the Zohar. Now, in order to do that, you have to be perfectly in phase. It means that your physical, emotional, intellectual, and your ruchnistic koichas have to be exactly in phase. If there is something wrong in some way, then you're in deep trouble. And that's fundamentally what happened. The only one who was in perfect harmony in all his different aspects was Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, he was able to go in and meet the Satan in that way and take the or out, at least for himself, not for Klal Yisrael, safely, you see. But the other ones were not able to. Why? Because obviously they were not in harmony, especially the Yeruchnistic part, the Koch Nefesh. The other three, their Zoyama, or the Klippa which they were in terms of their own Neshama, was too powerful in a certain way. So when it met the Satan head on, it was not able to extract it, and it caused damage to themselves. Shimon ben Azai, if you look at it deeper, you can actually understand by what happened to each of the individuals what the chasson was, what the problem was, the structural defect, if we may call it. But Akiva was the only one who had a structural perfection. The other three Tanoim, the very big Tanoim, had structural defects, and so on. And it's possible to see by the consequence, by the symptoms and the actual disease which emanated, what the structural defect was. In the case of Shimon ben Azai, who died, what it was is that the Chokhmah, apparently what it seemed to be for in terms of himself, that he was able to be masig the Chokhmah. He was very much in harmony. He was the closest to Rabbi Akiva in harmony. He was a tremendous masmid. Says there, Mishal Butler, I think when he died, Hasmoda left the world. He was a tremendous Muslim, Ben Azai. And obviously what happened was that his neshama was not able to handle the ore itself. That in order to handle that ore, the neshama had to leave the guf. The guf itself, the connection between the guf and the neshama, which represents a certain level of klipa, was too strong to contain the thing. So what happened was that the kedusha of Ben Azai was greater than the guf was. So what happened was when he hit that ore, the neshama jumped out to receive that ore. Ben Azai was a case where he was out of balance. There was a structural defect where the kedusha was greater than the geshem, which was capable of doing it, and this was a problem. You see, so he died. He died of Dveikus. Yes, Ben Azai fundamentally died of Dveikus. He died of Hasaga.
He was the one who was Nafshi Choshka B'Torah, right?
Yes, Nafshi Choshka B'Torah. He died of Hasaga. He died of two great overdoses of Hasaga Sechudoi. That's what happened to Ben Azai. Ben Zoma was something else. Ben Zoma, the next level, was Ben Zoma. What happened to Ben Zoma? Ben Zoma saw this ore, and the Kedusha wasn't able to handle it in a sense, but there was something wrong with the emotional part of him as well, in that sense. In a certain sense. So what happened was, the only way Ben Zoma can handle it was by completely blocking out the ore. But he couldn't block that ore out, so he had to block out his entire intellectual faculty. So he became a shaitan, became a shiga. Became a sugar. What happened because he was sugar? His ability to understand reality and fantasy broke down. So in order to deal with the strength, the tremendous strength of that ore, he suspended the entire reality, the ego function where he synthesized reality, and he suspended it, so he no longer could understand reality, which means he suspended the logical function. The intellectual, logical function was completely put in mute. You see. And he had to do that. Acha became an apikoros. He was stronger than Ben Zoma, in that sense. Acha was stronger because Acha did not have to suspend or put into mute the intellectual faculty. Except that what happened was that the intellectual faculty was not as damaged, but there was a certain defect which simply took the ore and fused it through a sheker, in a sense, and redefined the ore. He transformed the ore so that what he did was that he put a klipa onto the ore. You see, and he became an apikoros. He enclosed the ore with a klipa. You see, Ben Zoma simply suspended the rational faculty in that sense. Whereas Ben Avuya Acher clothed the ore with a new level of klipa and became an apikoros. Ben Azai didn't do it all. He didn't have to defend against the ore. But his problem was that his capacity to sustain that ore while alive was too weak, and his kedusha was too great, so he jumped out of the body. You see, the only one who was in phase was, of course, Rabbi Kiva, and that's why he was able to do that. And of course, we know Rabbi Kiva was the Sheretz of Mashiach ben Yosef. So there's a connection over there why had the capacity to recover that kind of ore. But the Meisim there of Dalet Shenichnas Pardes, the four who went to Pardes, is an excellent example. It's an excellent example of that when you attempt to grow, especially if you want to grow by leaps and bounds, all your dimensions have to be in a certain phase of harmony. There's got to be a certain harmonious relationship, especially when you want to grow very rapidly. You see, but this principle is even important in progressive growth, small growth. It's the exact same concept. You see, of the notion of structural change, that there's a constant state of structural transformation as you go from one level of stimuli to the next, and the structural breakdown and the structural reconstitution at every stage. But if you jump at a very high stage, you have to be very, very powerful in harmony to be able to deal with that, or else the stress will be so great that there will be a structural destruction, and that's what these three Tanoim experience. And that's what happened to Klal Yisrael if the Mashiach appeared without any hashpor on them to raise them to that level. The fact that Rabbi Kiva came out all right and the fact that the reason why he came out all right was because of the phase harmony is in the words of Nichnas b'Shalom v'Yotze b'Shalom, which it says over there in the Gemara, The reason why Rabbi Akiva was Yotze B'Shalom, he went out B'Shlemus, is because he was Nichnas B'Shalom. When he entered in a stage where there was structural harmony in the four different aspects of himself. And you can see that even though he was such a big Tana, he was married and so on and so forth. Whereas Ben Azai, as great as he was never able to be married in that sense. So obviously there was a defect. His hasmoda was so great, his cheshik v'torah was so great, that he was not able to be in a state where there's any kind of gufnius or gashmius. So therefore he was able to handle that or, but only as a neshama, not as a guf. And the only one that was able to handle all that chokhmah as a person and remain alive was Rabbi Akiva. But both Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai were greater than Ben Zoma and Acher, Elisha ben Abuya, because they had to handle the situation by some kind of integration or some kind of interaction with Zoyamah. There had to be an introduction of Klippa to remove the threat. You see. Whereas you don't find that. Rabbi Akiva came in safely and went out safely. Ben Azai died. But that has nothing to do with the Klippa. It simply means that he wasn't able to handle such Kedusha while alive. But Ben Zoma had to suspend the entire rational faculty, which means that there had to be some aspect of Klippa. And we'll see that later on when we discuss the inyanim of what a shayta is. What's involved, it means that the Zoom was so powerful that he had to go into what's called an anti-cone mode, and I'll explain that later on. He had to go into a situation where he no longer could deal with rational thinking, which is the usage of Klippa, because the Klippa has no shaykh to rational thinking as such. And also, Elisha ben Abuya was Acher became a min, or not Bikoros, and that's obviously almost the worst state of all, because what it is Bishim ben Azai, Ben Zoma. Ben Zoma became Meshiga, but by becoming Shima, you don't affect the Or. You don't affect the Or at all. All you simply do is switch yourself off. That's what you do. You know what I mean? It's a self-destruct item, you see. But you don't contaminate the Or itself. Whereas Lidishem and Abuya or Acher was the worst one of them all, or the lowest Madrega. Because his structural defect was such that the only way that he was able to survive was to take the Klippa and actually transformed the Or itself by taking the Or and putting it into a Klippa. Hence he became an Apikoros and a Min. That was the worst of all. But that's the worst level of adaptation. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva came out fine, but the other three, because of structural defects, had to exercise certain stress adaptations to too great of an Or of Vuchnius. Each one had a different level of adaptation or a different level of adjustment. And the type of adjustment that each one had shows you the kind of structural defect each one experienced prior to the stressful situation, which was the Dalet Shenichnas Aparis. Let's go back further. What is the nature of the Hashpor that will happen to Klal Yisrael? First of all, I want to mention that the Hashpor has nothing to do with your efforts. This is a very, very important thing to understand. That since the Moshe Mashiach will come Be'ita, that means that the whole thing will come because of the Yad Hashem, That means that Hashpor is going to come down on Klal Yisrael in spite of their efforts. Although if there's a slight inyan of Bechira, there will be a certain inyan of effort there, a slight inyan. But fundamentally, that Hashpor is going to come down. Like it says in the Pasuk, Umol Hashem es levavecha, and so on. There's going to come a time when the Baruch himself will transform the lave of all Klal Yisrael and make them zircha to the Gula Shlema. That's what, you know. It's not a question. See, it's not a question that Klal is going to have to sit down and suddenly start learning and doing tshuva and so on. That's not what it is. It's going to come down by itself, and it's going to make all of Klal Yisrael into Baal Tshuvas, spontaneously, automatically, and involuntarily. Now, what is the feeling like when that happens? It's the best thing I can say is that there is a extremely powerful awareness of MS, or wanting to know the truth, not wanting to become involved in any aspect of sheker, not wanting to also become involved in all kinds of maitim that have to do with the Yetzer Hara. There will be a distinct repulsion suddenly, which is a strange thing to realize. There's a distinct repulsion to getting involved into Chatoim. You see. But what's important to realize, it is an interim state. It's not a state of great Kedusha. It's a state of great sensitivity. There is a difference. Kedusha is a state of Shleimus. It's a state when you are imbued with Kedusha, when you're imbued with MS. You see, when you're imbued with Hatova and so on. This is not the state. This is a state where you want to be imbued with Kedusha, where you want to get rid of the Yetzer Hara, when you want to lift yourself up to a new madrega of Chochmah, a new madrega of Emes. You see, there's a tremendous chukka for it, but there will not be any actual state of that. There's the desire to achieve that, you see. And that will cause all the people of Klal Yisrael to become suddenly extremely dissatisfied with their condition. There will be a turbulence and agitation that every person will feel. And the only person who will be able to calm that agitation is the Mashiach himself. And that will be the zivug of Klal Yisrael to the Mashiach. It's a natural zivug. Some people say, well, how do I know, how will Klal Yisrael be Makav the Mashiach and so on and so forth? It's much simpler than that. It'll be like a natural zivug of like falling in love, right? When one person finds, a chassan finds his kala, right? How do the two know that they want to get married together? Suddenly there's a feeling, you see. The very shidduch, the very zivug of the two is what produces the kind of feeling where they both know that they belong with each other. You see. It's the same thing. Klal Yisrael, in a certain sense, is the zivug of the Mashiach because of what one wants and what he gives. It's a shidduch between the Noisid and the Makabel. It's the zivug shel emes, in that sense. The question is, does this hashpor affect only Klal Yisrael or does it affect the Goyim? What I believe is that when the Yechida comes down and the Kedusha comes down, it will only affect Klal Yisrael, and then it will affect the Goyim. The Goyim later on, as the Moshe Mashiach progress, will become involved in the Or of the Mashiach, in that Kedusha. They will become involved through their interaction with Yidden. They will clearly see that Yidden are those who possess that Kedusha. However, in the beginning, when the Hashpor first starts, the increased sensitization will happen primarily to Jews, but I believe that there will be a certain aspect that will also happen to Goyim. It is my belief that it will also happen to a certain degree to Goyim as well. And we'll see why I say that, because that's going to affect the Kibbutz Goliath. The reason why the Goyim will allow the Jews to leave their countries and leave their countries and go back to Klal Yisrael is because their own increased sensitization to the MS. But we'll get into that later. The hashpor that will come down on Klal Yisrael, and to some degree also on Goyim, in that sense, is the beginning of the force which will begin to decompose or disintegrate the Avuvia. Right now, Klal Yisrael is moving among the Goyim, the Erevav is moving among Klal Yisrael, and many levels of Erevav are moving among the good level of Erevav to the bad level. What we find is a tremendous Avuvia or mixture of many, many different elements with different Keichas HaNefesh. You see, the Tigboris Hara, which is the Shlita of the Satan on the Bria, has created this Avuvia, in that sense, because it appears that he rules over one. When that hashpor begins to come down, what happens is each individual will begin to feel that hashpor in a different way, so that the people with greater Keichas HaNefesh, with less tumah, begin to feel the sensitivity much more powerfully than those with less, and that slowly will cause different levels of the ummah to sift to different levels. You know, like in the physical process where they have like I think they call it centrifugal force, where they use it to separate. I think in qualitative analysis in chemistry, if they want to separate different components of a different chemical, they use a centrifugal force depending on certain features, chemical features of the element to do that. And I think what will happen is that that is the same thing, the force, the centrifugal force in a sense, that will do this is that hashpor, where it will begin to separate different levels of Klal Yisrael, Yidden from Goyim, who the true Jews are, and who the Goyim are that are in Klal Yisrael. You know, Erevav from Yidden, good Erevav from bad Erevav, and they will all sink to different levels of sensitivity. And that level of sensitivity will also become an indicator or barometer of what Kedusha each one will get. What's very important to realize that when that Kedusha of the Mashiach is inspashed to all of Klal Yisrael, right? Not every Jew is going to have the Orish Mashiach in the same way, you see. What's very important to realize that in the Moshe Mashiach, different Jews will experience the Or in a different level, depending on what his Maisim was. And what I believe is that the Or that every Jew will be makabel from the Mashiach and the Moshe Mashiach is directly proportional to the level of sensitization that will initially come on him as the original Hashpor comes down to sensitize him. You see, it's a kind of equal factor, and so on. So Klal Yisrael will be very distinguished in its many different levels of sensitization, and its different levels, of course, in the end of Kedusha. But what is very critical is that all of Klal Yisrael who lives at that time will all have the minimum level of sensitization, you see, to appreciate the awe of the Mashiach. Minimally, everyone will have that. How far they will be into that awe, to what nuance and subtlety they will be able to be misalig on that awe, all depends on the level of sensitization and the level of Kedusha. And that depends on the Madrega of all of Klal Yisrael, in terms of this. But this differentiation, which is really what it is, the differentiation process which begins to differentiate the various levels of the Avuvia will begin at the Hashpor of sensitization and will be concluded by the Hashpor of the Orish Mashiach. That will also differentiate Klal Yisrael of the Goyim itself. But I believe that the Goyim will also experience an aspect of that sensitization, and it is very important that they experience, because they will have to become part and parcel of the entire Gula process itself. It doesn't make sense for suddenly Klal Yisrael to rise up to an incredible level of such sensitization and the Goyim on such a tremendous level of Bahamas. You know what I mean? Of low level. It can't be, because they can destroy the situation. Because you have to remember, just like too much Kedusha, too much awe is a threat to Klal Yisrael without a preliminary sensitization. Too much awe in Klal Yisrael because it's a tremendous threat to the Goyim without some kind of level of sensitization on their part. You see, so what you find is this kind of graduated sensitization, and we're going to see that this concept of graduated sensitization or differentiated sensitization in different elements of Klal Yisrael and different elements of the Ummas Olam among themselves and as they relate to Klal Yisrael, it becomes a very key feature on the complete series of events that actually are going to take place in the Gula process. In the case of the Kibbutz Galus by Mashiach ben Yosef, but that we're going to get into at length. This is the key variable in which all the people of the world begin to react towards the figure of the Mashiach ben Yosef as the Gula becomes started. We established a very critical thing when we spoke last time, and the concept of the sensitivity of the Ummah, and we explained a very important principle. And what we said was that the process of Geula is a process of sensitization. That's fundamentally really what it is. But it's a dual sensitization. It is a sensitization on the Mashiach himself, and it's a sensitization on Klal Yisrael. Either one without the other, there would not be any Geula. In other words, the Mashiach himself goes through a whole process of Geula, where he goes out of the Klippa, and he's zeicha to Orish Mashiach, the Agonas, the Madrega of the sin, of the Shin, and so on. And that sensitizes them to the Or, which is the Pneumis HaTorah, the inner framework, the inner essence of the Torah. And Klal Yisrael is zeicha to a new sensitivity so that they can appreciate this new Or. You see, if the Mashiach only was sensitized to this, and Klal Yisrael was not, they would never accept the Mashiach. They couldn't understand it, they couldn't be tafis it. And like we said last time, that because of the fact that the Or of Mashiach is above their ability to understand and to comprehend it, they would have seen the Mashiach as a threat, either to do away with, to ignore, or something. But he would have constituted a very severe threat, because like we said, if too much truth or emes is presented to a person, and that person is not of the capacity to accept that truth or deal with it, what happens is he has to defend himself against it, and either he defends himself against it by intellectually attempting to ignore it, or discredit it, or destroy it. Because in any sense, it's a threat to his equilibrium. And that's what will happen if Klal Yisrael had not been sensitized. And that's what the Baruch says, fundamentally, I will sensitize all mankind. I will pour forth my spirit, which is the awe of Kedusha, a new awe, Umol Hashem Eslavovchem, on all of Klal Yisrael, and I will return them. You know, you see this in what the Baruch says, you see it in the Potik, Hashivenu Hashem Elacha v'nashuva Chadei Shemenu Kekedem. What's that Potik? We say, Klal Yisrael davens, Hashivenu Hashem Elacha, return us to you. You see, v'nashuva, then we will return. That's obviously, that's not a Nachishena, is it? That's a Be'ita. Hashivenu, in other words, you first return us to you. Sensitize us to your emes. And then, v'noshuva, then we will return, you know what I mean, to that emes. What's that emes? That emes is the Urish Mashiach. or chodesh al Tzion to'ir, v'nizkeh chulon b'me'or. A new or, a new light will shine from Tzion. You mean? That's what it means. And what's the second part of the pasuk? Hashivenu Hashem elecho v'neshuva chadesh yemenu kekedem. With that new or, we mechadesh our days kekedem. What's kekedem? Adam Rishon Kodem Achet. Exactly. With that or, we will be renewed, mischadesh kekedem, with complete tahara. So we see this in the pasuk. That's exactly what it is. Hashivenu Hashem elecha. Sensitize us. Esh bruchas ruchi al kol basa. Give us the ability to understand what this new or is. Make us hungry for that or and to thirst for this new light. You see. And once we have this thirst, and where will we find it? In the Mashiach. That's how they know one way that he's the Mashiach. Because he's the only individual in the entire world who can satisfy that hunger. You see. Now, and I wish there was some way, it can't be that I can convey to you what I use words, and I talk about psukim, about the union of Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'neshuva chadesh yemenu kekedem, and that we want the Baruch Hashem to sensitize us to this light, and it's difficult. I wish there was some way that I can give you some kind of understanding or hagosha of what that is. What that kind of thing is, if you study Hashkaf, you work on it a great deal and other things, you can come to some kind of glimpse of what that is. It is possible, and believe me that and I will say this in whatever you can understand, you can understand. What do you call it? Is that if any of you could appreciate what that light is, or that sensitivity, that kind of thing, when Klal Yisrael says Hashivenu Hashem elecha v'neshuva, and so on, and you could not sit in your chairs, literally. It's not a light thing, you see. I mean, it's not that make us frum, or be frummer. It's a whole different thing. It's not, it has no shaykhah to that. It has no shaykhah to being frummer. It's a totally different kind of quality. Make us learn more. Give me the koyach for our smother to want to sit down and learn. It has no shaykh to that. The best way I can explain what that sensitivity is, now I want to give you some kind of understanding there, to the degree that I understand it myself from a knowledge of the Hashkaf and so on, is that most I'm going to say something that sounds very strange, and this is really the heart of the matter. Most people think that when the Mashiach comes, everyone is going to be sitting and learning. In a base medish. In other words, take a yeshiva like Lakewood. It's a vast yeshiva with a lot of guys sitting and learning, right? Everyone thinks that when the Mashiach comes, what's going to happen is that the entire world will be converted into one big base medish, like Lakewood, or all of Eretz Yisrael. That's what it is. Everyone's going to start we're going to all sit and learn, open the Gemara, Lashon Tosfos, and hold on it. Everyone's going to be sitting and learning. All of Klal Yisrael, it's like one big yeshiva. That's what the Yemot Mashiach is. Right now, how many guys sit and learn? What fraction of the percent of Klal Yisrael really sit and do that, right? And everyone is involved in other things. And when the Mashiach comes and he's going to be Megali Yehuda in the world, everyone is going to sit and learn. And everyone's going to be Fumah. Everyone is going to daven with more Kavanah. Everyone's going to do mitzvahs in what do you call it, in a stronger way. More Mesiras Nefesh. Nechte Ketov. There's no shaykhs. You see, the world will not be Fumah in the sense that we understand what means Fumah. It will not learn more in the sense that we learn more. You see, to think in those terms is simply to expand Lakewood or every yeshiva quantitatively over the entire world. You see, the Or Shel Mashiach, the awe of that time, is an awe which has no shaykhs to any awe that you've ever seen, and so on. It has no shaykhs to any awe you've ever seen, or could even be masig in that kind of sense. It is such a powerful awe that it's not the question that everyone will be sitting and learning. It will be Magala, and we spoke about what that awe is a little bit, It will be Magala, the entire Chochmah of the Bria will open up, and the meaning of everything that has happened and every event that has happened will become suddenly clear, crystal clear, and it will simply be nothing more than one excursion of Hasagas Yehuda upon another excursion, where you go deeper and deeper into the pnimis of the Bria itself. You see, you will run after Torah like you run after your biggest Yetzer Hara. And that's only describing it slightly. The tainug of that kind of awe, of that kind of asaga, if I make myself clear, will be in such immense proportions, and we cannot be masking that, because who runs after Torah like you run after the biggest tiger, like who, what's and so on, But it's not a question that you're going to think about it. You will literally run after it with every piece of your life as if you need to survive. And it will give you such a tainug as you have never experienced the whole Yoma in all your days. When it says Chadesh Yoreinu Kedem, that doesn't mean simply restores to Adam, restores to what Adam was. And if we have any hasog of what Adam Moshe knew or saw before the Chet, it is staggering, because he was mastering the Makkah, many of the Lamas and so on. That state of being, you see, is what we want. The Oresh Mashiach is not more Hasmada and it's not more mitzvahs. Right? It is a new state of being. You know what I mean? It's a different state, it's a transformed state of being. As different as you are from Moshe Rabbeinu now, that's how different you will be in the Yemei Mashiach from what you are right now. That's how vast the difference will be. You see, it's a transformed state of being in that sense. That is what it means, the Oresh Mashiach. Nothing less. When I say you will not learn, you will not be, everyone won't be learning, it's not the question of learning. We won't be preoccupying ourselves with learning. Our being will become synonymous with learning. It's not a question that we become suddenly sit down with some kind of external activity where we'll sit and learn, like we learn now. We take a safe part, pull it out and start learning and so on. No. Your neshama will become fused with that light. Your mitzias will be the awe of Torah itself. You will be a walking Torah itself. You see? When you sit and learn, it's not to absorb information as such, as you're absorbing some totally external thing into yourself. It's not that. When you sit and learn, you'll be simply expressing, you see, outwardly what exists inwardly already. It's the neshama talking. Right now, it's the neshama listening. You see. But in the Osir Lovoy, Yemei Mashiach, Oresh Mashiach is the neshama talking. That's what a powerful relationship we will have with this all. In the same way, we will not be frumah. The word frumkeit is like, it's ridiculous. Even in Yerushalayim is like a thing. Because that all is so powerful as to minimize almost all levels of Bechira. There will be very little free will then, and we explain. Because it will even be higher than the time of Adam Rishon for the Chet. But your entire neshama will be one Yetzer Tov. You will be almost identical with the Yetzer Tov. You have almost a bare perception of what a Yetzer Hara is. In that time, people will be sitting down together, right? 100 years in its time. 100 years in the time of the Yemei Mashiach, let's say. And they'll be sitting down and they'll be talking. And the people will live a long time. And they'll be talking to each other and they're saying, one will say to another, I have some kind of recollection about 100 years ago when there was something called the Yetzer Hara. It was a Yetzer Hara, but I can understand a little bit of what it was because I still have, I could see, but I can't understand. What was that world like? How do we get involved in that? Why was it so important to me then? You see, it's exactly like when you're a child and when you're an adult. When you're an adult, when you see a little child playing with little blocks and getting excited because it sticks the block through, it found a square block, and it was able to stick the square block, right? The Fisher Price toys has like these little, big, and little shapes, triangles, squares, and circles, and has little blocks, and it tries to stick it through, right? And a little child, a little kid, with the first time put it through, it's incredibly exciting, right? And you as an adult look at it, and you can't understand what is, the excitement about that, and why a little child is so excited by the small, these small little things on. As difficult it is for you to understand the behavior of a 2-year-old, rather the emotional state of a 2-year-old, the being state of a 2-year-old, that's how difficult it will be for you to understand when you're in Yemei Mashiach to what it is now. So we will not be Yerushalayim as such. See? We will be such a big chelik of Kedusha that it will become part and parcel of us. Yerushalayim will be as natural to us as breathing. Like Moshe Rabbeinu says in the Torah, let's see. What does the Baruch Hashem ask of you except to fear Him? So the Gemara says, what is this? Moshe says, what does God want from you but to fear Him? So Moshe says, but to fear Him. So Chazal saying, what is the important for him? Is it such a simple thing? Like, what does the Baruch want? All he wants to do is to fear him, have some Yiras Shamayim. Like Moshe was saying it, relative to himself, it's a simple matter. You see, but relative to everyone it's very difficult. So Chazal was saying, is it such a simple matter that Moshe said, all he wants is this? So the Gemara says, yeah, as far as Moshe is concerned, it's a simple matter. You see, you know what I mean? It's a simple matter as far as Moshe is concerned. Now, would you call Moshe Rabbeinu Yiras Shamayim? The truth of the matter is Yiras Shamayim. But the truth of the matter is to call Moshe Rabbeinu Yiras Shamayim is not a really great shevach. You see, because to be Yiras Shamayim, Moshe became with Moshe Avdi. Moshe was the Eved Hashem. What is the meaning of an Eved? What is the meaning of an Eved? Normally, an Eved, for example, is an individual who listens to what someone else has to say. You say, I want you to do this, so the servant listens and he does it. But every Eved, even though he listens to what's being said, he countermands it. There's always a part of him that says, who are you to tell me what to do? There's a part of his ego and a part of his mind which basically would rebel. But he says, well, I'm your employee, or you have control over me, so I have to listen to you. When it says Moshe Abdi, when the Baruch Hashem refers to someone Eved, and that's why Eved is the highest term that the Baruch Hashem refers to. Alti or Yaakov Abdi. When the Baruch Hashem says Abdi, that's a staggering term. Because when the Baruch Hashem meant Eved, it means that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have any part of him that said no. His das was completely bottled to the das of the Baruch Hashem. Completely bottled. That's why the Avos, Avos Mitzvah Yaakov, are called the Merkava. They refer to it as a chariot. Because what is a chariot? A chariot, you have the rider and he rides the horses. The horses go wherever the guy wants. Right? The same thing with a car. Or does a car have a das to say, I don't want to go here or not? You steer it completely. That's what the Avos were. The Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu were like Avodim, they were like a Merkava, they were like a chariot. God rode on them and they did His will. You see. Now, you may say to me, how do you reach that kind of a level? Like, what is that level where a person can be so high that you don't even call him a Yiras Shamayim anymore, really, in that sense, and where he's a total Eved. The mere command of the Baruch Hashem we call suffices. We can have an understanding of that, and in a much simpler way. And this is really the essence of what really Yiras Shamayim is, and what these men have, no more, no less. In each one of our lives, there's somebody that you're very close to, that you love very deeply. And in this case, I would say that in such a case, it could either be your parents, or perhaps your wife, or your children, or whatever the story is. But in each one's mind, choose the individual who he feels very, very close to, and very close to, and so on. Now, if that individual was suddenly pained and went through a terrible sorrow, for example, if that individual you heard, Chas v'Sholom, went through a sorrow, very bad sorrow, an accident, or whatever the story is, Chas v'Sholom, how would you feel? You would feel crushed, wouldn't you? In other words, your feeling and your relationship with that other person is such that the slightest pain that comes to that person causes you immense pain. On the other side, what happens if you find out that something fantastic happened to that person? Then you are b'simcha. You feel very happy also. Why? Because that's the nature of love. If you love another person, whether it's your parents, whether it's your wife, whatever the situation, what is the nature of love? To love someone else is to feel the exact feeling of that other person in the way that you would have felt it. When that person undergoes a very bad sorrow, it agonizes you. It's mitzvah you. If we're talking about your father, if your father, Chas v'Sholom, went through a terrible sorrow and you saw his sorrow, it would crush you. And at the same time, if your father, for example, if we're assuming that's the individual, went through a tremendous simcha, it would make you happy. Why? Because he's happy. That's it. Love means that you're b'tzar when he's b'tzar, and you're b'simcha when he's b'simcha. And that's it. There's no other reason. Not because you're benefiting anyway. You see, just by the mere fact that you love him. That's exactly what a Yiras Shamayim is. All you have to do is develop that kind of relationship with Ribono Shel Olam, and you will have the exact same kind of feeling. That's really where it's at. When it says V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol levovecha v'chol nafshecha u'medacho, that's where the key is. The objective, as I've said many times in Yiddishkeit, the fundamental essence of all Judaism is not to do the mitzvahs. It's to develop fundamentally an intimate relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. It's to grow to love him in the most intense way. If you achieve that feeling, you see, and you know when you're about to do a chet, and so on, and you know that he doesn't want to, you know that it's mitzvayim in that kaviyachol. It will bring a tzar to you. When you find, for example, that you did a chet or you did something bad, it'll crush you to pieces. Not because you're afraid that you're going to get Gehenna, you see, or you're afraid he's going to punish you, why? Because you caused him pain. That is your pain. And the biggest simcha that you're capable of is when you bring him simcha. You will run to do a mitzvah. Why? Because it's going to make him happy. That's why. Just to give him nachas ruach, which is the tachlis of a person, is to give you tremendous simcha. You see, that is what a Yireh Shamayim is. And that's what Moshe was saying. What is the Bnei Shem saying? Kim liyirah. Of course, because if you love the Bnei Shem, like the Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Bnei Shem, it's a simple matter. You see, you no more would attempt to do something against the Bnei Shem than you would against your own father. Or you would hurt him in the same way. It's automatic. You see. Why? Because as soon as you did that, it would be a devastating feeling. That's what Yireh Shamayim really is. Now, La'asad Lavoi in Yemotzi Mashiach, you see, every Yid is going to feel that way. Every Jew will be intimately connected in a tremendous relationship with the Bnei Shem, in a very powerful relationship of love and ahava with the Bnei Shem. So to call that person, in a certain sense, a Yireh Shamayim, in a certain sense, that's not a milah, you know. To say that he's going to be fumma, you know, in a certain sense, that's a very minor term in that sense. What do you mean I'm going to be fumma? What do you mean? What do you mean I'm going to be fumma? What do you mean? As if there's different degrees of fumkeit. Anything which is mitzvah the Bnei Shem is mitzvah me. Period. And that's it. That is my entire Yiddishkeit. Not I'm going to be fumma. I'm going to daven with more kavanah. What do you mean daven with more kavanah? Do a mitzvah with more hergish. What do you mean? If it's going to bring him simcha, of course I'll do it. I don't have to be told to do it. Do you see what I'm saying? That will be the madrega of every Yid in that sense. This is the power of the Yireh Mashiach. So therefore, when I tell you that it is not a light matter, you see, that basically you will be transformed beings, that is what the Yireh Mashiach will do. And as I said before, and perhaps you can understand a little better, if you can but just sense this thing to a thousandth of what that is, of what that all is, you would no longer be able to sit in your seats. For such incredible simcha and for such just tremendous turbulence that will go on in you, that such a feeling can exist in the universe. It is so, mankind is so far, so devoid of that it's impossible for us to realize or accept the possibility and definitely the eventuality that this thing is real. But that's the Haftach of the Bnei Shem. This is real. And when it happens, it's going to hit you like a sledgehammer. And in a certain sense, it will not happen over a long period of time. When it comes, it's going to come quickly and decisively. You see. And like I say, one day you're going to wake up and you're going to say, wait a minute, this is not the same world as when I went to sleep. There is something decidedly, definitively different. You will say it, your children will say it, your wife will say it, your parents will say it, your friends will say it. Everyone will walk out of the house and begin to search around. What happened last night? The truth of the matter is that if you think that it's humorous in the sense of what 100 years from now what people were saying, there's even more humorous things. There's more humorous. It's really staggering. How long does Olam Haba last? Netzach Netzachim. Now, Netzach Netzachim is a long time, isn't it? Very long. Let us imagine a situation in Olam Haba, right? And let us imagine a situation 5 quadrillion years from now in the future. Now, 5 quadrillion years is a long time. That's after a trillion. There's a million, billion, trillion, and then there's quadrillion. I can go further than that, but then it becomes meaningless. 5 quadrillion years is 9, 12. Is 12? It's 5 with 12 zeros after it. 12 zeros. You know what? 5 quadrillion means 5. Is that 12?
9 trillion is 9 trillion is 12. 15.
I'm sorry, 15 zeros after it. 5 quadrillion is the equivalent of 5 billion million. That is a lot. So, you should know there are very few things in the universe which come up to that number. They're not even I don't know if there are more atoms in the entire universe than that number. I should know, that's a very large number. Wow. But in the Keneged Olam Haba, the truth of the matter is that's a very short stay. That's considered a short stay. Okay. So, 5 quadrillion years from now, a bunch of people are sitting together, and they're saying, of course, they're the Masi Yehuda, whatever they do, and they're saying, do you remember a long time ago? It's like eons back. I can barely remember what it is, and it's something we just passed down. But there was once some place called Olam Hazer, and there was something called a Yetzer Hara. What was that? Can somebody tell me what that was? What was that? And there was something called a Jew, a Goyim. There was something called Toma. But for God's sake, I have no understanding. Does anyone remember this? You know? Something called evil. There was something called Ritzicha. But what was that? You know? There was something called Taiva. I can't remember what that was. That is Olam Haba. And that's what will someday happen. Now, it will happen in the Yemei Mashiach to a lesser degree, but it will still happen to a very profound way. The reason why I say this, because what do I want to show you? We all think, and if I've ever taught anything, in the Shul, this is one thing that I want to teach, basically, which is very important to understand. Very, very important to understand. One of the ways that the Yetzer Hara gets all of us, one of his most profound arguments, and it's a non-conscious argument, we are not aware of it, it is so subtle, is that your life, your feelings, the world, society, the way it is now is absolute and was always that way and will always be that way. In other words, the way the world is now is reality. You see, that is an incredible flaw. You see, that's the way you get it. So people, we act on that thing, on that assumption. But the truth of the matter is, if we realize that even our feelings of taiva, all these things that we have, which we think is synonymous with our very being, we cannot